This is Poetry Lesson 1, Part 2, in which we will take a look at some common forms of poetry. You already know what poetry is. Any literature that is not prose is poetry. Now let's break it down a bit more. There are more than 150 forms of poetry out there, but we're going to take a look at 9 of the most common forms: the epic, the acrostic, blackout poetry, free verse, concrete poetry, haiku, blank verse, spoken word, and my personal favorite, the sonnet. It makes a lot of sense to look at the epic and the haiku at the same time. The haiku is one of the shortest forms of poetry with only 3 lines. The epic poem, on the other hand, is huge. It takes a whole book to hold it. This one, the Odyssey, written, we think, by a guy named Homer, is 12,109 lines long. I like to look at free verse, blank verse, and sonnet poetry all together because they can all be classified by whether or not the lines rhyme and by the length and rhythm of each line. We call that meter. Free verse poetry is, well, the freest form of poetry. It doesn't have to rhyme, and the lines can be any length. If you read free verse out loud, it sounds a lot like natural speech, but it's not prose. Prose, when you write it down, looks like a paragraph, not a poem. This poem is "O Me, O Life" by Walt Whitman. It has that famous line at the end: "The powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse." Blank verse also does not have to rhyme, but it does have a certain rhythm to each line. Most lines will have 10 syllables, and every other syllable is stressed so that it creates a very specific rhythm. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. Of writing many books there is no end. Can you hear it? Now, it shouldn't actually be read like that. If you read it in a normal voice, you can still hear the rhythm. Of writing many books there is no end. This poem is called Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Notice that the title, Aurora Leigh, is in italics, like a book, not quotation marks like a much shorter poem. This is a pretty good hint that Aurora Leigh is an epic poem. It's super long. The sonnet, like I mentioned before, is my favorite form of poetry. Like the blank verse, a sonnet has 10 syllables in each line that create a rhythm that sounds a lot like a heartbeat. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Unlike blank verse, a sonnet also has a very specific rhyme scheme. Day, May. 8, date. Shines, declines. Dimmed, untrimmed. Fade, shade. Owest, growest. And then it ends with 2 rhyming lines right next to each other. This is Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. It's probably the most famous sonnet ever written. My guess is that spoken word poetry might end up being your favorite form of poetry. The thing about spoken word poetry is that it really has to be spoken out loud to get the most out of it. Spoken word poetry is the kind of poetry you often hear at an event called a poetry slam. You may recognize spoken word poetry in another style called rap. Even though rap is often performed within a song, it isn't really sung, is it? It's spoken. There are no rules about length of rap lines or the patterns of the rhymes or the syllables, but rap definitely includes rhythm and rhyme. This is one verse of rap from a song called Me Against the World by Tupac Shakur. Our last little grouping of poem forms includes acrostics, blackout poetry, and concrete poetry. I've grouped these together because they only make sense if you can see them and read them for yourself. You've probably heard of acrostic poetry, and maybe you've even written some in school. The only requirement of an acrostic poem is that the first letter of each line can be read vertically, and the word or words the letters spell out will tell you the subject of the poem. This one is just called an acrostic by Edgar Allan Poe, and the lines spell out the name Elizabeth. Poe is famous for his poetry and short stories that are usually scary, so naturally this love poem has someone die at the end. Blackout poetry is sometimes called found poetry. It's created when a poet finds a poem somewhere within a page full of writing and then blacks out all of the other words so that the new poem stands out. These 2 poems are simple styles of blackout poetry. Here are two more Blackout poems that use color and illustrations to help communicate the tone of the poetry. Lastly, we'll look at concrete poems. In a concrete poem, the words of the poem are the illustration, often creating a picture of the subject of the poem. Shel Silverstein is famous for his concrete poetry, like this one called Lazy Jane. If you look at the poem on the right and squint at it just a bit, it looks like a panda. If you read the words, you'll find out that it's about extreme thinking, seeing the world in black and white and missing out on all the other colors of possibilities.